Welcome to The Explainer. This is where we take complex topics and, we break them down by going straight to the source material.
Okay, let's just say it. The word fascism. You hear it everywhere in politics today, right? It's thrown around so much it kind of feels like it's just a political insult. But is it? Or is there more to it?
So the real question is, can we actually get past the shouting matches? Can we have a real disciplined conversation about what this word actually means based on, evidence?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to try to do today. We're diving into a new book called American Fascism in 2025. And what's interesting is that it proposes a specific framework, a set of tools, really, to help tell the difference, to figure out if what we're seeing are just warning signs or something else entirely.
All right, so let's get into it. To understand the book's argument, we've got to start with its framework. It's kind of like building a diagnostic kit, and it all begins with some basic definitions.
So the book kicks things off by sorting governments by one key thing: how centralized their power is. At the very top, you have this broad category called autocracy. Think of it as any system where one person or one party has all the power and there are no real legal limits or public accountability to stop them.
Okay, so within that big umbrella of autocracy, the book zooms in on something even more intense: totalitarianism. This is where the state doesn't just want power. It wants total control to force a specific ideology on everyone. And here, the authors see a split. On the left, you've got communism, which is all about class and labor. On the right, you have fascism, which is built on this idea of blood and soil, basically a mythic, pure national community.
And this is a really key point the book makes, using a quote from the political theorist Hannah Arendt. She says, look, what these two systems share isn't their goal. Their ideologies are totally different. What they share is their method. Both of them get rid of any separation between your private life and public life, and they both use fear as the main tool to organize society.
So that brings us to the big question. How do you actually spot fascism while it's developing? This is where the book gets really practical. It takes all this academic research and boils it down into a diagnostic tool, a checklist of sorts. It's built around 12 warning signs, or dimensions, and it tracks them across different stages.
Now, this isn't just a simple yes or no thing. Think of it more like a rubric or a sliding scale. It measures how intense these tendencies are. For our explainer today, we're just going to look at the first 3 dimensions to see how this works. But remember, the book goes through all 12, and you can see how a country could go from a latent stage, where these ideas are just kind of floating around, to an early stage where they start showing up in policy, and then all the way to full-blown.
All right, so now for the main event. How does the book actually apply this framework to the US in 2025? Well, it takes each of those dimensions and holds it up against real-world evidence, stuff pulled directly from headlines, policies, and public statements.
Let's start with dimension number 1, nationalism as identity. The book cites evidence like, for example, executive orders that target anti-fascism and label it as anti-American. But it's not one-sided. It also points to counter-evidence, like protests or even other institutions pushing back against that kind of exclusionary idea.
So, after looking at both sides of the coin, what's the verdict? The book rates this dimension as moving out of that latent phase and into early-stage fascism.
Okay, on to the next one, enemy obsession. This is a big one. Here, the book points to a pattern of rhetoric that paints political opponents or immigrants or the press not just as people you disagree with, but as actual existential threats to the entire country.
And to really drive this point home, the book gives a direct quote from a top official. This is a perfect example of what it's talking about. The argument is that this isn't just political trash talk. It's a classic tactic. You create fear by painting your fellow citizens who disagree with you as a dangerous enemy from within.
And for this one, the book's diagnosis is, well, a lot more serious. Because of how intense and frequent this kind of talk has become, the authors argue the U.S. is right on the edge, edging toward that next full-blown stage.
All right, the third dimension we're looking at is military and violence valorization. This is about the celebration of force. It's when violence stops being seen as a terrible last resort and starts being framed as something noble, something cleansing, a good way to solve political problems.
And to back this up with data, not just feelings, the book points to a study from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The authors use this to show that, while you might hear that both sides are violent, the actual data on politically motivated killings shows a very different story, with the vast majority coming from right-wing extremists.
But it's not just about extremist violence. The book also lists concrete government actions it says are normalizing militarism in public life. We're talking about things like sending troops into cities for policing, even when local leaders say no, or proposing to rename the Defense Department back to the War Department, even using things like military parades as backdrops for political rallies.
So, just like with enemy obsession, the conclusion here is pretty stark. The authors see the celebration of violence as escalating, really pushing this dimension close to that full-blown category.
Okay, so that's the diagnosis, and it's pretty heavy stuff. So what now? What does the book say we can actually do about it? Well, this is where it pivots from just analyzing the problem to suggesting solutions. Real, practical things regular citizens can do.
And what's really interesting is that the book doesn't talk about huge, grand protests. It focuses on small, everyday actions, simple civic habits. Things like reclaiming national symbols for inclusive causes, or showing up at your local school board meeting, or even just gently pushing back when you hear someone use exclusionary language. The idea is that these little things, when done by a lot of people, can add up to something really powerful.
So, to wrap up the book's main argument, when they run the U.S. in 2025 through their 12-point framework, their final analysis is that the country shows clear signs of being an early-stage fascist state. A dangerous place to be, for sure, but, and this is key, not an irreversible one.
So, what we've done here is walk through one book's framework for trying to understand a really critical moment. It gives us the tools, it gives us a diagnosis, but it leaves us with a huge, lingering question. At what point does a political trend stop being just a trend and become a reality that you can't undo?